U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific in this part of the world are not new by any measure. And as a historian, I'm always at pains to point out that as a young maritime trading nation, the U.S. has recognized the importance of the Asia-Pacific from its earliest founding days. And to secure enduring American interests in the Indo-Pacific, the United States has maintained a permanent military presence in Asia for over 180 years, beginning with the establishment of the U.S. Navy's East India Squadron in 1835. So the U.S. has had a Pacific military presence before it even had a Pacific coast, which is an interesting thing to think about. And especially because we're here at AUSA, we should remind ourselves that our Army has fought more major campaigns in Asia than in any other region of the world, attested to by 62 campaign streamers on our Army flag, 32% of all of our 192 streamers. So the Army is no stranger to Asia over the not just decades, but centuries. And the China-Russia security dynamic is taking on new dimensions. Oriana is going to speak to some of that, I believe, in her comments. So just in concluding, just a few more comments about allies and partners, because we have to remind ourselves about this, even though it's so obvious. Strengthening alliances and attracting new partners is the second line of effort in the new national defense strategy, and clearly in the Indo-Pacific, our defense allies and partners are absolutely vital to anything we hope or need to accomplish. Logistically, they are the vital enablers of access and sustainment that our forces must have to overcome what Pacific planners refer to as the tyranny of distance.
First of all the airplanes talk to each other. You know, I wish we could do that with some of our Air Force airplanes. The data links, you know. Second, and they're not great, but of course, for ground forces, it's probably only at the brigade level that they can operate in this C4ISR system. They don't have the personnel, and they complain bitterly about the ability of their generals to manage it, but conceptually, they have it. And they think they operate from a position of strength because we are so dependent on space and cyber and long-distance communications operating from exterior lines of communication, and they're operating from interior lines of communication even out to and a little beyond the second island chain, and they've got air breathers and surface platforms they can use if we take out their own space. Next slide. This is a point I'm going to hammer here, and it's a point I'm going to hammer at the end. The United States Army is really, and the Marine Corps with the multi-domain task force and the expeditionary advanced base operations are really trying to engage air and sea from land. But it's an archipelagic defense. I think Andy Krapinovich 2 years ago did a great thing on that out in Japan. And it's a different concept for the Army. But what we want to do is ensure we can control these critical straits. And I have to say, Japan is right on top of this and maybe a little ahead of us in operating and creating their own forces and missiles. And, you know, they're not constrained. We're not constrained by an INF treaty anymore. They never were constrained. Abe's starting to push him toward these things, and I hope he gets there because we can work very well together. Next slide. I tried to do this because I think it's really important, and I'm glad I think it's Huntsville and Redstone are on here. At the AUSA convention, I talked to a lot of their people. It's a long time before we're in a position to even begin to deploy some of the things that China has deployed. And in some cases, we don't know how to counter these things. You know, I talked to a whole I mean, I started out as a dumb infantryman, and I'm still a pretty dumb infantryman, but I tried to ask, how can you counter a hypersonic glide vehicle, because it has this, heat shield, almost a heat shield around it. If it goes over, I think, Mach 7, nothing gets through, but it does get through from behind. So if you could have networked cooperative target engagement, maybe with things like high power microwave, if we ever get to railgun, there are some things you can do, but not if the Chinese knock out our networks. So this is really important. I think we're about equal in counter space. I think they may be a little ahead of us in high power microwave and some forms of directed energy. Their ability to spoof and jam GPS is way ahead. Our problem, we have weapon systems on ships and aircraft that won't operate without GPS. We have got to reach the point of different forms of PNT, precision, navigation, and timing. We have got to develop systems that will operate with multispectral forms of target recognition, or even terrain contour modeling if you're going against land. But we need something out there that'll not only recognize a ship, recognize whose ship it is, recognize its signature, and we need to protect what we develop that can do that. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide, except that they may be well ahead of us in a lot of areas, and I think they are. And the final important point that got hammered home to me when I talked to the Huntsville and Redstone people, 10 days ago, a week ago, is all these IOCs are only if Congress funds this stuff right on time. If the congressional funding stream dies or tapers off, the IOC tapers off and goes out further. And now let's go to that last slide, if you would, please. The Army, certainly the Army I was in and grew up in, and the institutional Army, when I talk to strategists, is used to, concepts like a contact force, a blocking force, and a decisive force. It's heavy armor. It's not as artillery and missile strong as either the Russians or the Chinese. The Chinese emphasize a lot on missiles. And that worked great. Air-land battle worked great in the first Gulf War. But this is a challenge for the Army, because the institutional Army, including where we are right now, I worked for Gordon Sullivan, Talleli, Reimer. These guys were Europe guys. They were heavy armor, artillery guys. So the institutional Army wants corps and divisions and large-scale land forces. And in Asia, that may work in Korea. You may need to do that. But you are not putting that on the People's Republic of China when it's a nuclear power. And now, as Carver told you this morning, Phil Carver, plenty of MIRVs. So I would argue that the institutional Army at times is going to be resistant, because a multi-domain task force is essentially going to be an artillery, an air defense heavy, and EW heavy formation. And I just went back through that national defense strategy another time. I don't even find the word electronic warfare in there. It's not in there. Now, the Navy hasn't forgotten about it, but, we need to get back at it. I think it's very important to talk about whether you forward deploy, preposition. I think the Japanese ground self-defense force is going to preposition some assets on islands they already own, and I'm quite sure we'd be welcome to do it. But where is this MDTF going to go? The Army wants one forward deployed. Well, I'll tell you now, it can only either go to the Philippines or it can go to Japan. You ain't going to get it in Vietnam and Malaysia and places like that. So So the other question for you is how much of a deployment plan should be revealed in exercises. I would argue you can do smart reconnaissance with small teams. The Air Force does it with their lily pad concept without showing your hand and letting somebody target a hypersonic glide vehicle on where you're going to put your next base or operating base. So you need to think about that. There's a great monograph out there. I think Brad Cooper did it on logistics support. I don't remember. Anyway, it's a great land warfare paper. And then the thing I wrestle with is what's the sweet time to it's going to be forward deployed. When do you activate and in place an MDTF? And this is a real question. If you put it out there in phase 1 or in phase 0, you've given everything away. You've given away your plan, and it may not be very useful. The National Defense Strategy emphasizes deterrence. Well, it's very difficult to deter the People's Republic of China in phase 3. The Politburo Standing Committee has already made a decision they're going to fight. And they've communicated it throughout the Communist Party. So they're not backing away. It affects their legitimacy. So we need to think about that. When is the best time? Would emplacement deter or trigger hostilities or create a real big target? All right, I got off there safely.
Thank you, Larry. And Larry's monograph is, I think, on display for your acquisition out front, and he goes into a lot more detail in it. And I know, Larry, the next thing I'm going to do after the conference is over today is get on eBay and see if I can find some coastal artillery brass. So, Oriana.
Okay, so I'm going to take this discussion a bit of a different direction. And I just want to thank the organizers for having me today. They invited me as Dr. Mastro, but I'm on duty all this week and all next week at the Pentagon. So you get Major Mastro, which usually means I'm a bit more diplomatic and polite than I am when I'm in my civilian uniform. But now that the general's gone, I mean, now anything goes. So now I can say exactly what I want to say about the Pentagon in this competition. I want to first start focusing my remarks on the relationship between China and the United States, China and Russia. Now, I know there was kind of a separate morning session on that. Now we're talking exclusively about China, but there has been an increased focus on the military relationship between the two sides. So I first want to kind of give my 2 cents about where that's going and then have some broader discussion about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So the first thing is, I think my bottom line assessment looking at what's happening between China and Russia is that concerns of a close alliance between the two countries are overblown, but we are not as concerned as we should be. So how can both of those things be true at the same time? Basically, when I take a look, and most of my military jobs I've been in plans and strategy, when I take a look at some of the challenges that Larry laid out, for example, in the AOR that we're dealing with China, you don't need a full-fledged military alliance between Russia and China in which China is militarily supporting China's goals in the region for it to be problematic. In my mind, if you had like a Russian squadron involved in a Taiwan contingency, we are already in a realm of difficulty, especially with respect to horizontal escalation and how we would respond to that. So that's why I think we're not concerned enough, because as far as I can tell, a lot of our thinking and planning does not require us to deal with both countries simultaneously in a conflict environment, even if these two countries' degree of coordination is going to be relatively minimal. So why is it the case that people are kind of starting to get concerned about China and Russia? Well, we see on the political side the two countries are becoming very close. Xi Jinping and Putin have met 7 times over the past 2 years, over the past year, excuse me. In the past, they've met about 5 times per year, 24 times since 2013. That's about twice as much as we meet with China or we meet with Russia. And from the military side, there's been a number of notable military exercises between the two sides that have kind of opened people's eyes to it. The first one really being a land-based exercise that Russia held in September of 2018, Vostok 2018, in which the Chinese did contribute a small number of troops to, but the most significant thing about that exercise was, for the first time, it was an interstate war scenario instead of a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency type of scenario, so it seemed to have more relevance to a Korea War contingency, for example. There's a number of other exercises that they have done. Obviously, the Chinese are getting some training from the Russians on the S-400. They've established a joint naval command system between the two sides. All of that, as that was going on, didn't really, at least for me, spark any sort of concern. One thing that we have to think about when we see how often China is engaging with Russia militarily is this is in the context of Chinese military engagements increasing across the board, around the world, in all countries. There was a recent study that looked at Chinese military engagement, and one of the things also when you look at the Indo-Pacific being the priority region, China is engaging militarily as much with UCOM countries, almost as much as they are with Indo-PACOM countries when you take into account the number of countries in each command. So China's military is trying to be more involved all over the world, and obviously we're going to see an uptick in their relationship with Russia as an organic component of that increase more generally. So this expanding of military relationships around the world, the fact that you had little differences in the exercises, in my mind, people who started to get concerned about the relationship, it was a bit overblown. But then something happened in July that made me rethink how I was thinking about this issue, and that was we had the joint air patrol between China and Russia. And I had lunch with the assistant defense attaché, the Chinese defense attaché, a couple weeks after that. We were having a conversation about it, and he was like, I too was surprised that we did that. I couldn't quite figure out what the rationale was behind it. For one, I had assessed in a previous foreign affairs article that China would want to exploit this rift that is happening between Japan and South Korea, mostly by courting South Korea because they are much more confident in their ability to get the South Koreans closer to them. So to upset the South Koreans by doing this joint air patrol over this contested territory, in which the South Koreans did respond by firing on some of the aircraft, it seemed like a very strange strategy to me. And it was also interesting because what it made me realize was I had downgraded the possibility of cooperation because I had an assumption that maybe is not correct. And that assumption was that Russia would want a reciprocal relationship with China. So as a China expert, I am very confident in my assessment of China's views on Russia, specifically that they have, Russia's on the way down, China's on the way up. China has no appetite for international crises that they don't create themselves. They don't want to be attached to Russia. They see as Russia as kind of not a legitimate power, and they definitely don't want to be supporting Russian expansionist goals in Europe. So in my view, I was like, well, if the Chinese military is not going to be supporting Russian territorial goals in Europe, then surely Russia is not going to be willing to support Chinese goals in Asia. But what some of these more recent, like that recent exercise suggested was maybe that's not true. Maybe Russia is okay with an asymmetric relationship because it gives them more power and influence in Asia. And so even if China is not going to have their back on a lot of their issues, they're going to be willing to support China in the Indo-Pacific. And if that's the case, then I think we're going to see a lot more Russian involvement in Asia than we have in the past, and that is going to severely complicate things. So even in a North Korea scenario, I've written extensively about Chinese planning for North Korea. People always ask me about Russia, and I say I'm not worried about Russia because the Chinese won't let them intervene. The Chinese were like, no, Russia, you're not. This is not your game. You're going to stay out, and the Chinese feel like they're confident in determining the degree to which Russia can play a role in the region. But now all of a sudden, China seems to be inviting Russia in. Russia seems to be willing to cooperate. And so this is a big area of concern. When you look at what it means for the United States in the region, both China and Russia are taking intimidating actions towards Japan, a U.S. ally. They complicate the North Korea scenario. Already, I've done a number of assessments which I basically argue that the U.S. military's plan to, for example, engage in counter WMD in North Korea is never going to happen. The Chinese are going to get there way before you guys even start thinking about moving up north. And so that, it's already complicated because the Chinese, are going to be in Korea. Our ideas about they're mainly concerned about refugees, buffer zones. Those are ideas from the 90s. They no longer think that way. If you look at their force posture on the border, and if you talk to the Chinese military, like I have, they basically say, the 80,000 to 120,000 PAP that they have along the border will take care of the refugee issue. The PLA is going in, and they're going in as deep as they can. So then you think about that, and you think about Russia along with them, everything gets a lot worse. We know that diplomatic political power, China is leveraging a lot of international institutions, co-opting them for its own gain. There has been a degree of strategic echoing between the two sides, in which, at the very least, they like to counter what they consider, U.S. hegemonic power. So, to conclude, I have some thoughts, not to disagree with Dave, but to provide maybe an alternative view about the U.S. position in the Indo-Pacific. I am a lot less optimistic than he is about the Indo-Pacific being a priority and about the Department of Defense actually changing the way it does things to address some of the unique challenges. So the first thing I would bring up is just a question for the audience is it possible for the United States to successfully compete against China and Russia at the same time? To me, it doesn't seem like we're putting adequate resources towards the competition with China. Is it because we are also trying to focus on Russia? And given that we're focusing on both, we're driving these two together. So is that the right strategy? This is obviously a very simple way of looking at it. But if you look at how much Russia spends on its military and China spends on its military, China spends 4 times more than Russia does. And then if you look at our allies in Europe and our allies in Asia, our allies in Asia spend half as much on defense as our allies in Europe do. So just from a pure numbers perspective, it seems to me like China is a bigger threat. And I also agree with the Chinese assessment that Russia is on its way down. Russia is not going to be challenging the United States for superpower status anytime soon. They're a problem, they're a disruptor, but so is North Korea. And we don't consider them to be a number one geopolitical competitor, right? So is it the right focus to say we're dealing with China and Russia at the same time? Second sort of thing is the Indo-Pacific a priority region? Now, a lot of our senior leaders say it is, and they have been saying it is for as long as I've been doing this. But I don't always see it. I think a lot of this senior leadership, first of all, I would love to do a survey to see how much time they actually spend thinking about the Indo-Pacific versus other regions. Because at least in my positions, in my jobs, it's not always the case that the focus there is on China. I'd be very curious in this room of how many of you would say the majority of your career is on the Indo-Pacific. I see we have some Canadian allies here. Would the Canadians agree that the Indo-Pacific is the most important region in the world? I talk to our European allies. They don't agree. Half the time, we can't even get our Asian allies to agree that the China challenge is the most important challenge. So, is it the priority region? I'm in the middle of my PME. The Air Force just redid its PME. They have a section to study all the regions of the world. Guess which one is missing? East Asia. So from my perspective, I talk to the Army a lot about their new thinking and strategy about the Indo-Pacific. It seems relatively underdeveloped compared to the other ones. I still can't figure out what the mission is half the time when I talk to the Army guys at the Pentagon. I'm like, I'm happy to provide you feedback, but I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish. And this is the case across the board with a lot of our senior leadership. So I would like to believe it's the priority region, and I'd like to believe that we are focused heavily on doing what we need to do to compete. But I am fearful that it's like what was said by General Murphy. What I see more is us trying to do the same exact things and expecting different outcomes. Yes, allies are important, but it seems to me that doubling down on alliances is not enough to deal with this challenge. Yes, military exercises are important. Foreign military sales are important. But, doing more air shows and doing more exercises is not going to be enough, even if we are the security partner of choice. That's no longer enough. China is offering a bundled deal, and we aren't offering what these countries want. And so on a good day, I sit back and I think, well, the United States and China are fundamentally different. We are better partners than the Chinese are. But then when I think deeper, so yesterday I spent the afternoon with senior government officials from Latin America and the Middle East, and they're not convinced that it's better to be reliant or safer on the United States than China. I'm not an expert in these regions, so I can't think of primary examples, but at least in my experience, most of people at the Pentagon say it's a problem of the narrative. Is it? Or is it actually a problem of policy? And so if the United States wants to compete with China, I think we have to be expending much more of our resources and efforts on competing and thinking about doing things fundamentally different than we did during the Cold War, because this is a fundamentally different threat. And that means getting rid of being so risk averse. Especially in my civilian job, I come up with a lot of new ideas about how to deal with issues. And the response I usually get is like, well, that's not how we do things. And I always say, well, it might be my Air Force background, but usually, you brainstorm, get all the ideas out there first, then you can weigh them and decide which ones are horrible ideas. But let's get them all up first. But instead, it's like the viewpoint is we have to do exactly what we've always been doing. And so I don't see how that means we're going to get different outcomes. And we have to change everything from, promotion structures in the military to how the Pentagon is set up so that we can be more competitive. Because I would ask you, are we hungry and are we driven? When you walk around in your work, do you think that people feel the burden of responsibility of competing to ensure that a free and open society gets to not only continue, but gets to determine the rules of engagement around the world, that people understand what is at stake? I will tell you, I was just in China last week. I spent a lot of time there. They are hungry and they are driven. And I don't think that sense of urgency has reached us yet, so that we can really think deeply about how to be competitive, how to be a better partner. And part of that might be rethinking what our priorities are. Not only should we be spending this much time in the Middle East or not, but can we compete with China and Russia at the same time? Can we, potentially have a conflict on the Korean Peninsula and still have the resources to be competitive against China? It seems like we have some tough choices to make. Luckily, that is all above my pay grade. So I will just
Thanks,
I will
Oriana.
just end there.
So a couple of important things that Oriana has just done. Number one, she has just laid out the outlines of what could be a great debate. Are we just talking the talk, or are we walking the walk out there? That's a legitimate question to ask. I would suggest you spend some time with the Navy. They have a very different view of the world than perhaps you're running into. But I didn't. If I didn't hear you mention this, I apologize. But the other China-Russia exercise that certainly got my attention, and in the circles in which I travel, was about a year ago when the PLA Navy and the Russian Navy did an exercise in the Baltic Sea. That did. Who did? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the PLA Navy now having a base in Djibouti gives them the opportunity to do a lot of things in the EUCOM AOR. I'm sure Mike Scaparrotti is glad he's retired at this point, Guy. So thank you very, very much, Oriana, for those really, really helpful remarks. Brother Dean?
Good afternoon. My thanks to the Association of the United States Army for the opportunity to be here. Let me say how frustrating it is to be the third speaker when you've had two speakers who are both excellent and provocative, and you have prepared remarks that you have promised that you are going to present instead. So, my comments are going to be about jointness and Chinese thinking about future warfare. One of the key things to keep in mind is that the Chinese view of future warfare has been steadily evolving since the 1990s, and we see this in their descriptions of how they think about future conflict. We had local wars under modern high-tech conditions, local wars under informationized conditions, and then informationized local wars. One of the key elements of all of these conceptions is joint operations, and this is because of the reality that the Chinese have not fought a war themselves since 1979, but have been very, very careful students of other people's wars, mostly the United States, in part because we have fought quite a few wars, but also increasingly Russia. So what is the Chinese conception of joint operations? I think it's useful to note that entering the 1990s, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, in fact, had no clear concept of joint operations. They had never done it themselves. They pointed to the famous, I'm sure this is taught everywhere, at every command and general staff school around the world, the Yijiang-San campaign. I mean, it's like Gettysburg, right? Yes, exactly. Roughly a brigade of infantry, a flotilla of destroyers, and several squadrons of aircraft. This was the most extensive example of joint operations at PLA. 56, yes. So, I mean, very relevant. For the Chinese, the first Gulf War was therefore an enormous wake-up call. And the reaction to the first Gulf War saw the first real effort by the Chinese to develop joint doctrine. And so in the 1990s, we saw the Chinese talk about what they termed coordinated joint operations. And these would be conducted at the Zhongtuan level. What is a Zhongtuan? A group army, a military region air force, or an entire fleet. So what that really meant was that the Chinese were thinking about joint operations in the 1990s in a way that Admiral Turner or Spruance would have been thinking about it. I mean, core interoperating in the same physical space at roughly the same time as a numbered air force. For the Chinese, this was a major step forward in the context of joint operations. Interestingly, we saw in Chinese writings at the time a specific rejection of the Soviet concept of joint operations. Chinese writings were quite explicit. The Soviets got it wrong. Why? Because the Soviet version of joint operations was really combined arms, armor, artillery, infantry, Army aviation by the 1980s. But the point was, it wasn't inter-service. The Soviet Navy, despite the best efforts of Admiral Gorshkov, was almost an appendage, and well, we still have an Air Force officer here. The Air Force's role really was to fly support for the ground forces. It was not, I mean, it was its own service, but it had no real strategic conception. By the 2000s, however, we saw the Chinese moving forward. The 1990s, you could almost describe Chinese writings on joint operations as a Chinese translation of Chinese translation of Soviet terms used to describe American concepts. As you can imagine, a kludged together set like that, very messy, not very clear. What we saw in the 2000s was an evolution to what they termed integrated joint operations. Now we go away from simply what are the Americans doing, and let me use a Chinese translation of Russian terms, which we've already rejected conceptually, to truly joint operations with Chinese characteristics. So now we see joint operations at lower levels, at the brigade level, at squadrons and wings, at flotillas of ships. More importantly, jointness moved from being across services to across domains. So now we already saw, and this is still true for the Chinese, joint operations involve operations across land, sea, and air, outer space, and the electromagnetic domain and/or information space. Notice it isn't just about being between services, it's about bringing together, in a sense, a concert of capabilities across these various operational spaces. Also, jointness would now be throughout the course of operations. It wouldn't be sort of, okay, air does its thing, now it shifts to ground. It would be integrated throughout the course of the battle. And indeed, one of the things that it most closely resembles is effects-based operations, as we described it in the 2000s. A central aspect of this is shared situational awareness. You cannot have joint operations unless you have shared situational awareness among all the forces, which in turn elevated the importance of information. And this is where we saw the rise of local wars under informationized conditions, and today what the Chinese term informationized local wars. Why do we see, part of that shift to informationized local wars reflects what the Chinese now term operating under the new circumstances, 新形势. These new circumstances, with each iteration, what we have seen is a Chinese military that concludes high tech is important, but not all high tech is created equal. It is the information that flows across these various systems that allows my forces to coordinate their operations, their effects, their tempo, that allows them to be in the right place at the right time in the right proportion. And so, as information technology has continued to improve exponentially, the importance of information technology, because of the flow of information expanding, has also become more important. And so we see the Chinese writing about artificial intelligence. They write about a lot about artificial intelligence, but in the military context, we're not talking about Terminators, okay? Just give them to me. Instead, what we are talking about is using artificial intelligence to wade through the gigabytes of data that your sensors, that your weapons, that your human intelligence, that your UAVs and everything else gives you, to find and narrow down the nuggets, not again to make the AI make the final trigger pulling decision, but to weed it down to maybe 3 or 5 options that then the commander and staff won't be overwhelmed in considering. Let me note here, again, that when the Chinese are writing about this, increasingly they are not just citing American examples, although they do so extensively, but there have been interesting analyses of Chechen 1 and Chechen 2, the 2 Chechen wars the Russians had, operations in Georgia, and especially operations in the Ukraine. I'm not talking about the political warfare aspect. They all do analyze that. I'm talking about the ability to bring down hellacious amounts of fires onto Ukrainian battalions that makes them dissolve. Okay, so we're talking about very traditional, conventional warfare that they are thinking about. So let me conclude by noting the PLA is thinking very hard about future warfare, and among these will be the space and information domains. Outer space, frankly, doesn't matter. What do I mean by that? They're not worried about operations involving the satellites per se. Well, they have developed an entire service that will look at electronic warfare, information warfare, cyber, and space because of the information that flows across it. So if I can get the information by using space, space matters. If I don't have to rely on space, space doesn't matter. What matters is the information. Let me note that in this regard about information, there are some very interesting tensions and relationships that we've seen in the Chinese-Russian relationship. There is political tension and concern, but consider that Vladimir Putin announced the signing of a contract with China that Huawei would build China's 5G network. I mean, that is a level of comfort that clearly we don't have, but arguably relatively few European countries even are quite prepared to say we endorse and welcome them. And finally, the PLA is a party army. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Its first and foremost mission is to keep the CCP in power. But I'm going to say something quite heretical here. I believe Samuel Huntington was wrong. Oh, wow, no lightning today. You can have a party army that remains nonetheless professional. And the PLA, yes, it is not like our military. It has not sworn to defend the Constitution of China, but the party. But these are professionals thinking really hard about hard questions like, how do I defeat a technologically equivalent or superior foe across multiple domains in a way that will leave the nation equal or better off? Thank you very much.
Dean, thanks for a masterful toward the horizon of the evolution of Chinese doctrine. Just a couple of amplifying comments while we're collecting more questions from the audience. Number one, go to the website of the U.S. National Defense University Institute for National Strategic Studies, and you can find a copy of a recent publication entitled Chairman Xi Remakes the PLA, in which you will find some remarkable scholarship on the unprecedented reform and reorganization that the PLA has just gone under. And this reform and reorganization is very much tied to what Dean just had to say about doctrine, because for over 30 years, the PLA had been struggling with the command and control relationships that joint operations demand. They tried and failed over almost 30 years to impose joint operations command and control on their legacy organization. It didn't work, so they decided destroy the legacy organization, and build a new one. So the PLA has just undergone the Goldwater-Nichols reform from hell. And I don't say that flippantly, because just as it took an act of Congress to force the United States Armed Forces to become the joint force we are today, it took an edict from the Chinese Communist Party to force the PLA to do what for many years they knew they had to do to reform and reorganize, but which they could not do on their own because of vested bureaucratic interests. Which then brings to mind the remarkable article that Don Starry wrote in Military Review in 1980s when we were resisting airland battle, and he wrote the article called "To Change an Army, Why Cultural and Organizational and Doctrinal Reform is Difficult." So with that unsolicited historical backdrop, we have some questions here. I'm going to read off some of them and let the panelists decide. Now, some of our folks, they have to leave and catch a train soon, so they are hereby given their hall passes if they have to do that. But the first question, with the establishment of the Chinese base in Djibouti, how does the PLA view forward basing as part of their global force management strategy? Larry?
First of all, I think the National Bureau of Asian Research, Nadej Roland, just published a great study on the BRI and
Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, and Kristen Gunnis, who used to be with Dave at CNA.
Everybody used to be with Dave at CNA.
I was never at CNA. Anyway, she's got a great chapter in there that looks at the future expeditionary PLA. I've got a monograph 2 years old at the Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, Taking the Fight to the Enemy. I think that Djibouti is only the start, and that we will see either access agreements or other bases, because when she got into power, and even before him, his predecessor, they charged the People's Liberation Army with developing the military capability to secure China's economic and political interests, and most of those now are on the Belt and Road Initiative.
Can I just add, I think it would be a mistake to think about China's global military aspirations in any way related or parallel to how the United States does business, right? Because China has also said, people say, China writes a lot about the United States, writes a lot about Russia. It doesn't necessarily mean they want to emulate us. And for a lot of their writings about the U.S. global military presence and our use of foreign military operations or intervention as a key foreign policy tool, in their mind, this is the reason for the U.S. decline, right? So I don't want to suggest that China is not ambitious, but I use this example a lot because I think it's useful. When the United States was going to become a great power, we didn't build a colonial empire because Great Britain before us had one. It didn't mean that we didn't want to be a great power. It meant that the nature of the international system had changed, and what is necessary to be powerful and to protect your interests had changed as well. So I think for the most part right now, China, well, I think they want to dominate the region militarily. They want to rely primarily on political and economic tools to protect their interests abroad. Now, there's a big question of whether they can do that, right? If something happens, they get dragged into something. But for now, those types of things are censored in China. If something happens to a Chinese citizen abroad, the party makes sure that there is no call to do something about it. So I think Djibouti, they still kind of consider that a bit of the region. So you're still in the Indo-Pacific. It is, they would say it's not a military base, it's a logistics access point. And that's not just in name. I think for the Chinese, it's important to note that they don't plan on having offensive forward military capabilities. And I'll just say that China changes its mind all the time, so they might change their mind on this point. If they do, we will see observable indicators that has happened. And actually, I think that's how the United States wins this competition. I'm not worried about a global military competition with China. the farther they get from China, the worse they are. If they want to compete with us militarily in the Middle East, in South America, great. The problem is, so far they're smart enough to know to compete with us militarily only in the region, and then focus on economic and political tools more broadly.
I think those are some great comments. So thanks, Oriana. I think it's pretty clear that I think it would be a stretch to assume that the Chinese want the PLA to have a global to be a global military force the way we are. But it is also clear that they feel that they need to have a global military presence where they have national interests. And the Party Congress does talk about a PLA that has different missions than we're used to. Again, it all depends on where you came in on this movie. So I don't disagree with you. I think we don't have to worry about the PLA as a global military power the way we think about it, but they are going to have presence. And presence has its own set of challenges for some of our planners.
Yeah. So 2 quick comments. One, I think part of the answer to that question is knowable, but only if anybody here can task various assets to go and get it, because it's going to be Chinese. And the answer, I think, will reside in what was the Chinese conclusion about Libya? Not the about Libya, not the toppling of Gaddafi, but the reaction to the Chinese presence in Libya as Libyans were toppling Gaddafi. Because here are the Chinese with some 30,000 workers in Libya, and the Chinese attitude is, look, we paid you guys off. I don't mean the workers, I mean the government. And we aren't taking any sides. We're here to drill oil and make money for everybody. And yet, China wound up having to evacuate 24,000 workers. By the way, that was the first time they ever had to do a non-combatant evacuation operation.
And it wasn't mostly PLA. It was mostly commercial. The PLA couldn't do it.
That's right. It was civilians. It involved Chinese shipping, Chinese airlines, et cetera. So what lessons did the Chinese derive from this? Did they conclude the solution is to topple governments in the future on our own? Is it to prop up governments? Is it to have a better intelligence capability to know what other people, governments and non-government rebel factions might be doing? Is it to simply spread more briefcases of cash and uncut diamonds to all players so that everybody wants us to stay? I don't know the answer. I don't know that anyone in our side of the pond knows the answer, but I will bet you that the Chinese have thought long and hard about this, and that what we are seeing, whether it is bases in Djibouti or expanding the PLA naval infantry by a factor of 4.
The Marine Corps.
Marine Corps. The building of new amphibs, all of that. To what extent are any of those reactions, and to what extent is any of that likely to then lead to changes? And one other quick observation then about something Dave observed, which is greater presence. One of the big problems, I think, between us and the Chinese is we are raised on the idea of inadvertent escalation, because we fought World War I and everybody learned the lesson, one of the lessons, which is, oops, a crisis develops a momentum of its own, let's not get into a crisis. The Chinese don't seem to have that fear. They seem to much more believe that crises are like the old TV show, The Outer Limits. We have taken control of your television set. We control the vertical. We control the horizontal. We control the volume. But I think so I think that the Chinese have this unwarranted belief that crises don't develop a momentum of their own. So if we have presence, we're sending a clear signal, we're showing our interests. Nothing's going to happen unless you, of course, decided you wanted something to happen. Friction is fiction.
Okay. Well, that's the first question. So here's one. How do we best allocate the finite amount of U.S. and allied ground forces to counter China and Russia simultaneously over the long term? And can we really do both? I think Oriana raised that question also. Did you write this one, Oriana? Yeah, you want to address that?
I mean, I think the first thing is that the logic of what our ground forces are there to do, it has to change, right? Because a lot of the conflicts in Asia besides North Korea, that's like a unique one, there is no tripwire, right? So the Cold War thinking is by pre-positioning forces, our enemy has to overrun these forces in order to start some sort of conflict, and this signals that the U.S. resolve to fight is very strong. But most of the conflicts, the way we think about them starting in Asia, even though the ground forces would be involved in certain components, contingencies, and scenarios, mostly they're going to start in the naval and air space. And in these spaces, there is no tripwire. There is always a separate, China can always take some sort of military action without attacking the United States first, right? So the question, I would have for the person who wrote that question is like, why do you think we need troops to be there to begin with? If it is to signal, U.S. resolve and enhance the credibility of our deterrent, I don't think, the physical presence of troops has the same impact on that decision making as it did in the Cold War, when most of the conflicts we were thinking about with the Soviet Union were ground-based.
Some of the concepts that we're talking about here are applicable in the Kurils north of Japan. They're applicable in the Baltics and around the North Sea, and they're very applicable across the archipelagos around the Pacific. So I think some of these things, some of you can't remember that far back because you weren't here, but we had concepts that were designed to blockade and prevent Soviet naval and air forces from getting outside the island chains, both in the Atlantic and Pacific. And then we were going to destroy them in detail and kill them in place. These expeditionary advanced base operation concepts and MDTFs can do that. So I don't think you need to be everywhere at the same time. I don't think you should write off some of these capabilities. But now they have to be really coordinated. Remember, we've got a great Air Force, but if the weather's really bad, you better have artillery and missiles.
Okay, we're going to take a leap with this question from the operational to the strategic. It's a long one, so bear with me. Without ignoring the challenges of a partnership between China and Russia and the challenges it would pose to the U.S. and its allies, how can we shape a desired future that would prevent such a shift in scenario? Do we partner with China as the rising power? Do we partner with Russia as the paranoid diminishing power? Both? Or do we find a way to pit them against each other? So the essence is, how do we shape a desired future in which we don't push them maybe together, the Chinese and the Russians, and we find a way to shape the situation? If I haven't massacred it, I'm sorry to the author. Dean, I know you're dying to do this one.
All right. I'm going to be very blunt. That's the wrong question. It's the wrong question because it denies agency. So, how can I get Kermit the Frog here to do what I want? Simple. I stick my hand up his, I take his sticks and I basically manipulate them. So, Cloaca, yes, thank you. No, look, Russia is a major power. It is a declining, weak major power. A good friend of mine described it as a mafia-run gas station with nuclear weapons. I didn't come up with that one. But if you think that you're going to
We are being telecast.
If you think Russia is going to do what we want because we are going to be wise and manipulative, wow, you are an optimist. China is 5,000 years old. It's even less susceptible, arguably, to manipulation, certainly by us. So what I would suggest is we need to think about, along these lines, what happens if they do align? How would we know if they separate? What is in our interest to work with either or even both on? There may be some things that are. How do we corral allies and influence third-party neutral states to not join up with them, to persuade them that time and effort are on our side? I think it is very dangerous, by the way, to say, oh, they won't get together. Okay? I think there is a little too much of there was a Sino-Soviet split, there'll be another one again. Maybe, maybe not. It could be a very long time. In the meantime, we face something that that was true, by the way, from, say, 1949 until 1960, a period of these two countries working together. I think the pattern of the time was to form alliances, to look to influence neutrals, and to recognize that we are waging as much a political war, hybrid warfare influencing public opinion, as we were a actual kinetic conflict.
I'll just quickly add that, maybe there is a way, and I'm just like making this up right now, so I haven't thought it through too much, that this could be beneficial for the United States, in that one of our major problems is getting other countries on board with our agenda, right? Even our allies and partners. If you're in Europe, they're like, who cares about what China's doing? I have to focus on Russia. So maybe if Russia and China are working closer together, then all of a sudden the Russia threat becomes the China threat, and the China threat becomes the Russia threat, and that will make it easier for the United States to get European allies on board with countering some of the aspects of the China threat, and our Asian allies on board with countering some aspects of the Russia threat. But I agree. The main thing is that China is becoming powerful because countries confer power and influence to China. So the competition is not about just undermining what China is doing. The competition needs to be about the United States being the most attractive partner to everybody else. And we always talk about it, but actually we're doing very little in most countries in the world. We think we got like a few of the good countries, so we're set. The other 160 countries, who cares about them? But that's not how the international system works anymore. So I think we need to focus on that. Maybe we can leverage this emerging Russia-China thing to our advantage.
So that raises sort of an interesting question. Thanks for that, Oriana, as usual, forcing me to think, which is something I don't get to do much as a bureaucrat these days. So the larger strategic question one could ask is the US-China competition a political, economic, sociological, technological competition with a military component, or is it primarily a military competition with all of the others? And how we couch that and how we think about it makes a world of difference in how we approach the problem. And what's been so remarkable to me as a erstwhile observer of all of this is how quickly the Pentagon did its shift with the national security strategy and the national military strategy and the 1 June 2019 Indo-Pacific strategy report, which is billed as not a strategy. Because the Pentagon is very good at shifting, right? It's been interesting to see how mindsets have changed so quickly. And because the rest of the interagency, one perceives, is trying to catch up with the Pentagon in its views. That's not, but they're trying, but no. Or not catching up with the Pentagon. So I'm not going to debate that with Larry. So when you go out to the region, one of the concerns that you hear when you speak to friends, allies, partners, and others is that, why is everything with you Americans a military solution, right? And that's, bureaucratically, because the Pentagon is able to salute very quickly and move out on an issue, and where's the rest of the interagency? We're trying hard to bring the economic dimension, the political engagement dimension. So I just point that out as an issue. Here's a question I'm not going to ask the panel, but I'm going to throw the question out there anyway. Nobody should answer this question. What country is our greatest ally in Asia? And how does our friction and conflict with China affect our relationships in Asia? That's a great question. We're not going to answer that one.
I would say my husband's Australian, so I only have one answer always to that question.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more. DOD seems to view competition as a zero-sum game with a winner and a loser. What are the challenges with this way of thinking related to China, and are there opportunities for cooperative competition? Okay. Any takers?
There are places and things that we actually cooperate about, both with Russia and China. Now, there are a number of Chinese who do see competition as a zero-sum game, but not even all of the Chinese. And I'll kind of go back to Dave's first statement where I began to debating. The fact of the matter is, you've heard here a few times whole of government approach. What Russia and China can do is orchestrate and dictate a whole of government approach and actually pull levers and say it'll be this much money. And that. We cannot and do not do that. We perhaps only did that in the Marshall Plan, and we perhaps only began to do that in the Reagan administration. And as long as you have Treasury with one set of goals and Commerce with another, and the State Department with another, and Defense trying to lead the way, if the National Security Council isn't putting it together, we're going to lose.
Nobody can argue with that, but I'm going to remain the starry-eyed optimist and believe that we're not as dumb as we look here in Washington. Which reminds me of a joke I once heard. About this idea of the Chinese interagency. One day Xi Jinping issues a directive, and he wants to find out what everybody thinks about it. So he calls up the party secretary in Shanghai and he says, "What did you think of my directive?" And they said, "We read it, we disagree with it." Boom, right? He calls up the Guangzhou party secretary and he says, "What did you think about my directive?" And the Guangzhou party secretary says, "We received it, but we haven't read it yet." Boom. And then he calls the Chongqing party secretary and they said, "What directive?" It's a lot funnier in Chinese. Okay, I think we've pretty much, we have some folks here who have to catch a train. And I want to thank Larry and Oriana and Dean for some really interesting, informative, and also provocative, thought-provoking comments. And I want to thank my classmate, Guy Swan, for the opportunity to come back to AUSA. You got my $40. As soon as I walked in, they asked for my credit card. Thanks, everybody.